What happens when a fleeting moment of passion ignites a fire that threatens to burn down everything you've built? As I stood there staring at the man who wasn't my husband, I realized I was standing at the edge of a cliff, ready to jump. But where would I land? And would I survive the fall? Before we dive into this unforgettable journey of secrets, temptation, and heart-wrenching choices, don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more stories that will keep you hooked. And let me know in the comments, where are you watching from today? I'd love to hear from you. When the knock came at the door, I froze, my heart racing for reasons I couldn't quite explain. It was a sound I had heard countless times before, but yet today it carried a weight I couldn't ignore. I opened the door, and there he was, the delivery man. His uniform was slightly damp from the rain, clinging to his muscular frame in a way that made it impossible not to notice. His face lit up with a charming smile, a smile that seemed to hold a secret, one I suddenly wanted to uncover. "Afternoon, Mrs. Lancaster," he said, his voice warm and smooth, carrying an edge of familiarity that made my stomach flutter. "Please call me Emma," I replied, my voice catching slightly. His eyes held mine for a moment longer than necessary, and I felt a strange tension hanging in the air, heavy and unspoken. He handed me the package, his hand brushing against mine. It was a simple, fleeting touch, yet it lingered on my skin long after he stepped away. The scene at home. The door closed behind me, and I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The package sat forgotten on the counter as I leaned against the door, feeling an unfamiliar heat creeping up my neck. This wasn't the first time I'd seen him, but it was the first time I'd felt something I couldn't explain. Something forbidden, exhilarating, and terrifying all at once. My husband, Mark, was away on another business trip, as usual. Our marriage was stable but devoid of excitement. The man I had fallen in love with years ago had become a shadow of himself, always preoccupied with work, leaving me to fill the empty spaces of my days. I told myself I was content, that this was the life I had chosen. But the encounter that changed everything. The next day, the rain continued, casting a gray hue over the house. I was curled up on the couch with a book when another knock startled me. I wasn't expecting anyone, and for a moment I hesitated. But the curiosity won, pulling me to the door. There he was again, rain dripping from his dark hair, his smile just as warm as the day before. "Another delivery?" I asked, trying to sound casual, though my pulse quickened. He nodded, stepping inside to set the package down in the foyer. The scent of cedar and rain followed him, intoxicating and oddly comforting. "You should get out of this rain," I said, surprising myself. The words had left my mouth before I could think them through. "Maybe be just for a minute," he replied, his voice low, if testing the boundaries of this unexpected invitation. We stood there in silence for a moment, the rain pattering against the windows. He looked around the house, his eyes lingering on the family photos hanging in the hallway. His gaze softened when it returned to me. "Beautiful home," he said. "You must spend a lot of time keeping it perfect." I smiled faintly. "It keeps me busy. But do you ever take time for yourself?" His question caught me off guard, and I didn't have an answer. Before I could deflect, he stepped closer, closing the space between us. His presence was magnetic, pulling me in against every rational thought screaming in my head. I could see the rainwater clinging to his lashes, the faint curve of a smile playing on his lips. Crossing the line. "I should go," he said finally. But neither of us moved. His words said one thing, but his body said another, leaning in just slightly, his breath warm against my skin. I felt my resolve crumbling, the invisible line we were towing threatening to dissolve entirely. Before I could second-guess myself, I stepped closer, our faces inches apart. "Thank you," I whispered, though I wasn't sure what I was thanking him for. perhaps for seeing me, for making me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. The kiss was inevitable. It started slow, tentative, as if we were both testing the waters. But the moment our lips met, something inside me broke free, a wave of emotion crashing down and pulling me under. His hands found my waist, firm and grounding. As when we finally pulled apart, the reality of what had just happened hit me like a tidal wave. His eyes searched mine as if he was waiting for me to say something, to take it back or push him away. But I didn't. I couldn't. "I should go," he said again, his voice hoarse. This time, he meant it. I nodded, unable to find the words to stop him. He stepped back, the warmth of his touch still lingering on my skin, and opened the door. The rain greeted him, cold and unrelenting, a stark contrast to the fire that had just ignited between us. As the door closed, I sank to the floor, my heart pounding. I didn't know what I had just done or what it meant for my marriage, but one thing was certain. Everything had changed. The days that followed felt like a blur. My mind kept replaying the kiss, the heat of his touch, the way he looked at me as though I were the only person in the world. It was thrilling and terrifying, a secret that burned inside me with every passing hour. Mark called that evening, his voice distant and distracted as he went through the motions of checking in. I listened to him talk about his meetings and the colleagues he had dinner with, nodding along though he couldn't see me. I barely registered the words. My responses were automatic, devoid of feeling. All I could think about was him. The delivery man's name was James. I found it written neatly on the package slip he had left behind. Even seeing his name on paper sent a ripple of something through me. Guilt, excitement, longing. I had never felt this way before, not even when I first met Mark. I told myself it was a one-time mistake, that I would move on and bury the memory deep where it couldn't hurt anyone. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. Not yet. Another encounter. It was raining again a week later when I saw him. This time I was in the garden, pruning the roses that had grown wild in the unrelenting weather. I spotted the familiar truck pulling up to the curb, and my heart jumped to my throat. I turned away, trying to focus on the task at hand, but it was no use. I could feel him watching me, his presence magnetic even from a distance. The sound of his boots crunching against the gravel drew closer until he was standing just behind me. "Morning, Mrs. Lancaster," he said, his voice breaking the silence. I turned slowly, my hands trembling slightly as I met his gaze. "James," I said, my voice softer than I intended. He nodded toward the garden. Beautiful roses. I glanced at the flowers, their vibrant reds and pinks glistening with raindrops. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the tension between us palpable. He shifted his weight, his hand brushing the edge of his uniform pocket as though he didn't know what to do with himself. "I shouldn't have," I began, but he cut me off. "Me neither," he said quickly, "but I don't regret it." His words sent a shiver down my spine. I looked up at him, searching for something in his eyes. An apology, an explanation, a way out. But all I found was honesty. He wasn't sorry. And, God help me, neither was I. Succumbing again. "I have a package for you," he said, finally, holding out the box he'd brought. His hand brushed against mine as I took it, the touch lingering just a second too long. "Thank you," I said, though I wasn't sure if I was thanking him for the package or something else entirely. The air between us was heavy, electric. Before I knew it, he had stepped closer, his hand lightly grazing my arm. My breath hitched, and I felt the world tilt beneath me. "Dude, Emma," he said softly, his voice laced with something I couldn't quite name. "Tell me to leave, and I should have. Every part of me screamed to push him away, to stop this before it went too far, but I couldn't bring myself to say the words. Instead, I closed the space between us, my hands finding their way to his chest. The kiss was different this time, bolder, more desperate. It wasn't just a kiss, it was an unraveling, a surrender. His hands gripped my waist, pulling me closer as we stumbled into the house. The door slammed shut behind us, sealing us inside this forbidden moment. To thaw out. Hours later, as I lay on the couch staring at the ceiling, the weight of what we'd done began to sink in. James had left, his scent still lingering in the air, a tangible reminder of the line we had crossed. I thought about Mark, about the life we had built together. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours. And now I had shattered it, trading the security of our marriage for a fleeting moment of passion. The sound of my phone vibrating on the coffee table jolted me back to reality. It was Mark, calling to let me know he would be home a day earlier than expected. My stomach twisted in knots as I answered, forcing my voice to sound normal. "That's great," I said, my words hollow. "I'll see you tomorrow." After hanging up, I sat there in silence, the enormity of my actions crashing down on me. I had less than 24 hours to figure out what to do, how to hide the evidence of my betrayal. A new reality. The next morning, I cleaned the house meticulously, scrubbing away any trace of James. I told myself it was over, that I would never see him again. But as I stood in the doorway watching Mark's car pull into the driveway, a sinking feeling settled in my chest. Mark stepped out, his face lighting up when he saw me. He kissed me on the cheek, his touch warm and familiar. It should have comforted me, but it only made the guilt cut deeper. "How was your trip?" I asked, forcing a smile as he carried his bags inside. "Exhausting," he said with a laugh. "I missed you." I nodded, my heart heavy with the weight of my secret. For the first time, I realized the price of what I had done. It wasn't just my marriage I had jeopardized. It was the man who had trusted me, who had loved me, flaws and all. As Mark unpacked, I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror. The woman staring back at me was unrecognizable, a stranger caught between the life she had and the one she had risked everything for. And yet, as much as I wanted to undo it all, a part of me couldn't forget James, the way he made me feel, the spark he reignited within me. I was trapped in a web of my own making, unsure of how to move forward without tearing everything apart. The secret beneath the surface. Mark's return didn't offer the solace I had hoped for. Instead, it felt like a magnifying glass was now hovering over my every move. Every word I spoke felt rehearsed, every touch of his hand against mine a reminder of the betrayal I carried like a second skin. That night, as he sat across the dinner table recounting his trip, I found myself nodding in all the right places, but barely listening. My mind was elsewhere, consumed by James, his touch, his voice, the way he looked at me as if I were the only person in the world. "Are you okay, Emma?" Mark's voice broke through my thoughts, startling me. "Of course," I said quickly, forcing a smile. "Just tired." He nodded, accepting the lie without question. That was the problem with Mark. He trusted me too much. He had no reason not to. As the days passed, I buried myself in routine, trying to erase James from my mind, but it was impossible. Every knock at the door made my heart race. Every delivery truck that passed the house sent a thrill of anticipation coursing through me. I was unraveling, and I didn't know how to stop it. A risky choice. It was a week later when the knock came. This time I was ready. I opened the door and there he was, standing on the porch with the same knowing smile that had haunted my dreams. "Mrs. Lancaster," he said, his voice low and teasing. "I hope I'm not intruding." I hesitated, glancing back into the house. Mark was at work as usual. The house was empty save for the ghosts of my thoughts. "What do you want, James?" I asked, though the answer was written all over his face. He stepped closer, his eyes locking onto mine. "You." It hung in the air, heavy with meaning. I knew I should close the door, send him away, and pretend this never happened. But I couldn't. The pull was too strong, the temptation too great. I stepped aside, letting him in. The door closed behind him, sealing our fates once again. Falling deeper. We didn't speak as he followed me into the living room. Words felt unnecessary, a distraction from the inevitable. He reached for me, his hands finding their way to my waist as he pulled me close. This time there was no hesitation, no pretense of resisting. Our lips met in a rush of heat and urgency, the world around us fading into oblivion. His touch was electric, sending shivers down my spine as he guided me to the couch. For a moment, I let myself get lost in him, forgetting the life I had built, the promises I had made. It was reckless and dangerous, but it was real. He made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. But reality has a way of creeping in no matter how hard you try to escape it. As we lay there, tangled together, a pang of guilt shot through me, piercing the bubble we had created. "I can't keep doing this," I whispered, my voice barely audible. James propped himself up on one elbow, his eyes searching mine. "Then don't," he said simply. "Leave him." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. Leave him? It was a thought I hadn't allowed myself to entertain, even in my darkest moments. "I can't," I said, shaking my head. "It's not that simple." "It is," he insisted, his voice firm. "You deserve to be happy, Emma, with someone who sees you." His words were tempting, a lifeline in the storm I had created, but they also terrified me. Leaving Mark would mean destroying everything we had built together, the life we had shared, the future we had planned. And yet, staying felt like a betrayal of myself, of the woman I was becoming. The warning signs. The following days were a whirlwind of emotions. I tried to avoid James, to distance myself from the chaos he had brought into my life. But it was futile. He was always there, a constant presence in my thoughts, a shadow lurking just out of reach. Mark began to notice the change in me. He commented on how distant I seemed, how distracted I was. I brushed it off, blaming work and stress, but I could see the worry in his eyes. One evening, as we sat on the couch watching TV, he turned to me, his expression serious. "Emma, is there something you're not telling me?" The question caught me off guard, and for a moment I panicked. Did he know? Had he found out? But his tone was gentle, concerned, not accusatory. "Of course not," I said, forcing a smile. "Why would you think that?" He hesitated, his eyes searching mine. "You've just seemed different lately, distant." I reached for his hand, squeezing it reassuringly. "I'm fine, Mark, really." He nodded, but I could tell he wasn't convinced. The guilt weighed heavily on me, threatening to suffocate me under its weight. I had to make a choice. End things with James or risk losing everything. The ultimatum. James didn't make it easy. He showed up again, this time with no pretense of a delivery. He stood on the porch, his eyes burning with intensity as he looked at me. "We need to talk," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. I stepped outside, closing the door behind me. "What are you doing here?" I hissed, glancing around to make sure no one was watching. "I can't keep doing this, Emma," he said, his voice low but firm. "I need to know where I stand." His words hit me like a tidal wave. I knew this moment was coming, but I wasn't ready for it. I wasn't ready to choose. "You know I can't leave him," I said, my voice trembling. "I can't just throw everything away." James stepped closer, his hand brushing against mine. "Then tell me this," he said, his voice softening. "Do you love him The question hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. Did I? Or was I clinging to the idea of who we used to be, of the life we had built together? I don't know, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. James nodded, his expression unreadable. Then figure it out, he said, stepping back. Because I can't keep being your second choice. He turned and walked away, leaving me standing on the porch, my heart aching with the weight of his words. The weight of the decision. James's words haunted me long after he left. Do you love him? The question replayed in my mind on an endless loop. It wasn't a question I had ever allowed myself to ask, not even in the quiet moments when Mark was away and the house felt too big and too quiet. Mark, oblivious to the storm raging inside me, continued to go about his routines. He kissed me on the cheek each morning before leaving for work, his goodbye tinged with the same predictable rhythm that defined our marriage. There was no passion in his touch, no fire in his eyes. That night, as we sat across from each other at dinner, I watched him closely. The way his eyes stayed glued to his phone between bites of spaghetti, the way he nodded absently to my attempts at conversation, offering half-hearted responses. I had told myself this was enough for years. But now, after James, I wasn't so sure. A whispered confession. A week passed before I saw James again. This time, I was the one who sought him out. I waited until Mark had left for work, my heart pounding as I drove to the nearby park where James had said he liked to spend his mornings jogging. I spotted him near the trail, leaning against a wooden fence, his gaze lost in the horizon. He didn't see me at first, and for a moment I considered turning back. But then he turned, his eyes locking onto mine with a mixture of surprise and something else. Hope, maybe. Ella, he said, his voice softer than I'd ever heard it. What are you doing here? I hesitated, my breath catching in my throat. I needed to talk to you. He nodded, motioning for me to follow him. We walked in silence for a while, the sound of our footsteps blending with the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Finally, he stopped, turning to face me. Sal, what's on your mind? He asked, his tone careful, measured. I don't know what to do, I admitted, my voice trembling. I'm so confused. James's eyes softened, and he reached out, his fingers brushing against mine. You don't have to decide right now, he said gently. But you do have to be honest, with me and with yourself. I'm trying, I said, tears welling in my eyes. I really am. He pulled me into his arms, holding me as I cried. His touch was steady, grounding, a stark contrast to the chaos swirling inside me. For the first time in weeks, I felt a semblance of peace. The turning point. When I returned home, the guilt hit me like a freight train. Mark's car was in the driveway earlier than expected. My heart raced as I stepped inside, bracing myself for whatever awaited me. Hey, Mark called from the kitchen. His tone was light, almost cheerful, and it caught me off guard. Hey, I replied, forcing a smile as I joined him. He was standing at the counter unpacking groceries. I thought I'd surprise you, he said, holding up a bottle of my favorite wine. Dinner's on me tonight. I stared at him, the weight of my secrets threatening to crush me. He was trying, in his own way. He still cared, even if it didn't look like the love I once craved. And here I was, tearing it all apart. Mark, I said, my voice cracking. Can we talk? He paused, his hand stilling on the bottle of wine. Of course, he said, turning to face me. What's going on? I opened my mouth, but the words wouldn't come. How could I tell him? How could I confess that I had betrayed him, that I was questioning everything we had built together? Emma? His voice was laced with concern now, his brows was furrowing as he stepped closer. What is it? being really overwhelmed lately with you being away so much and everything. I've been feeling really overwhelmed lately with you being away so much and everything. His expression softened and he reached for my hand. I know, he said. I've been meaning to talk to you about that. I've been thinking about cutting back on travel, maybe taking some time off. I want to be here for you more. The sincerity in his voice was like a knife to my chest. Here he was, trying to fix things while I was busy breaking them. Sounds nice, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He pulled me into his arms, holding me tightly. I love you, Emma, he said, his words muffled against my hair. I know I haven't been perfect, but I'm going to do better, I promise. I nodded, tears streaming down my face. He couldn't see the full extent of my pain, of the war raging inside me, and I wasn't sure I could ever let him. A moment of clarity. That night, as Mark slept beside me, I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing. James's words echoed in my head, as did Mark's promises. I was caught between two worlds, unable to fully commit to either. But something shifted in me as the hours ticked by. I realized that this wasn't just about Mark or James. It was about me, about what I wanted, who I wanted to be. I couldn't keep living in limbo, torn between the safety of my marriage and the passion of my affair. I had to choose, not for them, but for myself. The final choice. The next morning, I woke with a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in weeks. Mark had already left for work, leaving a note on the counter about dinner plans he was making for us that evening. The thought of his effort filled me with equal parts guilt and gratitude. But today wasn't about him. It was about facing my truth. I called James. My hands shook as I dialed his number, the weight of what I was about to do pressing down on me. He picked up on the second ring, his voice warm but cautious. Emma, he said, I wasn't expecting to hear from you. We need to talk, I said, my voice steady. Can we meet somewhere private? There was a pause before he answered. Of course. The park? No, I said, shaking my head even though he couldn't see me. Somewhere else. Your place, maybe. He hesitated, then agreed, giving me the address. I hung up, my chest tight with anticipation and dread. A conversation with James. James lived in a modest apartment on the edge of town, a stark contrast to the world I shared with Mark. As I stepped inside, the simplicity of the space struck me. It felt real, unpretentious, a reflection of James himself. He gestured for me to sit, his expression unreadable as he sat across from me. What's on your mind? He asked, his voice calm but tinged with tension. I took a deep breath, meeting his gaze. I can't keep doing this. He nodded slowly, as though he had been expecting it. I figured you'd say that. It's not because I don't care about you, I continued, my voice trembling. I do, but this isn't right. For either of us. James leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. Do you love him? He asked, the same question that had haunted me for days. I don't know, I admitted, but I do know that I owe it to him and to myself to try, to figure out if there's something left to salvage. James's jaw tightened, but he nodded, his eyes softening. I get it, he said quietly. I don't like it, but I get it. I reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. You've made me feel things I haven't felt in years, I said, and I'll always be grateful for that. But I can't keep lying to myself or to him. He nodded again, his fingers brushing against mine. You deserve to be happy, Emma. I hope you find that. Tears welled in my eyes as I stood, pulling him into a hug. It was a goodbye, but it wasn't bitter. It was the closure we both needed. facing Mark. That evening, I returned home to find Mark in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for the dinner he had planned. He looked up when I walked in, his face lighting up with a smile that was both familiar and foreign. "Hey," he said, setting the knife down. "How was your day?" I hesitated, the words caught in my throat. This was the moment of truth, the moment I had to decide whether to let my secrets fester or lay them bare. "It was eventful," I said finally, stepping closer. "Mark, we need to talk." His expression shifted, concern etching lines into his forehead. "What's wrong?" I took a deep breath, my heart pounding. "I haven't been honest with you," I said, my voice trembling, "about how I've been feeling, about us." Mark's eyes searched mine, confusion and fear flickering across his face. "What are you talking about?" "I felt lost," I admitted, tears streaming down my cheeks. "For a long time, and I let that feeling lead me to make choices I'm not proud of, choices that have hurt us, hurt you, without you even knowing." The silence that followed was deafening. Mark's face fell, the realization dawning on him like a slow, painful tide. "Emma," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry," I said, cutting him off. "I'm so sorry. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I need you to know the truth. I need us to have a chance to move forward, whatever that looks like." Mark sank into a chair, his hands running through his hair. For a moment I thought he wouldn't say anything, but then he looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and resolve. "Do you want to fix this?" he asked, his voice steady despite the storm I could see raging inside him. "Yes," I said without hesitation. "I want to try, if you'll let me." He nodded slowly, his gaze unwavering. "Then we'll try, but this isn't going to be easy." "I know," I said, taking his hand. "I'm ready to do whatever it takes." The days that followed were a whirlwind of raw emotions and difficult conversations. Mark and I sought therapy, peeling back the layers of our marriage to confront the cracks we had ignored for so long. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when I wondered if it was worth it. But slowly, piece by piece, we began to rebuild. As for James, I never saw him again, but I carried the memory of him with me, not as a source of regret, but as a reminder of the woman I didn't want to be, and the woman I was trying to become. Looking back, I realized that my affair wasn't just about James or even Mark. It was about me, about the emptiness I had let grow inside me, the pieces of myself I had lost along the way. In the end, facing that truth was what saved me. It didn't erase the pain or undo the damage, but it gave me a chance to start over, to find a new way forward. And for that I was grateful. A farewell with reflection. The house was quiet now, the way it always felt after Mark left for work. But today, the stillness wasn't suffocating, it was different, a kind of peace I hadn't known in a long time. As I sat at the kitchen table, a cup of tea warming my hands, I let myself reflect on everything that had happened, on what I had lost, and perhaps what I had. For weeks, I had felt like I was living two lives, one with Mark, where I played the dutiful wife, and another with James, where I explored parts of myself I had long buried. Now, with James gone and Mark and I working to rebuild what we had, I felt like I was finally living just one life again. But that life was different now. Different because I was different. The woman I used to be. I thought back to the woman I was when Mark and I first met. I was young and full of dreams, a romantic who believed love could conquer anything. And for a while, it felt like it did. Our early years were filled with passion and laughter, the kind of connection that made the world feel smaller when we were together. I believed in us wholeheartedly, in the life we were building, in the future we were creating. But somewhere along the way, that spark faded. Life became a series of routines, a checklist of responsibilities. We stopped looking at each other the way we used to, stopped talking about the things that mattered. I told myself it was normal, that this was just what marriage became after a while. But now, I wondered if I had let go too easily, if I had settled for less when I should have fought for more. And then James came along, and everything I thought I knew about myself, about love and loyalty, was turned upside down. He awakened something in me, something raw and untamed, something I had forgotten existed. It wasn't just about the physical connection. It was about being seen, being desired, being reminded that I was still a woman, not just a wife. The lessons James taught me. James wasn't the villain in my story, nor was he the hero. He was simply a man who came into my life at a time when I was vulnerable, when I was searching for something I couldn't even name. He didn't give me the answers, but he made me ask the questions. He made me confront the parts of myself I had been avoiding. The loneliness, the resentment, the yearning for something more. Our time together was fleeting, and yet it left a mark on me. It forced me to see the cracks in my marriage, the cracks in myself. It showed me that I had been waiting for someone else to fill the void inside me, when all along, I needed to do that for myself. Letting James go wasn't easy. Saying goodbye felt like closing the door on a part of me I had only just rediscovered, but it was necessary. He was never meant to be a permanent part of my life, and deep down, I think we both knew that. What he gave me wasn't a future. It was a reminder of what I needed to fight for in the present. Facing Mark. Mark's face haunted my thoughts during those first few days after my confession. The pain in his eyes, the way his voice wavered when he asked if I wanted to fix us. It was a kind of heartbreak I wouldn't wish on anyone. And yet, in his willingness to try, I saw the man I had fallen in love with all those years ago. The man who had been there all along, even when I had forgotten how to see him. Rebuilding our marriage wasn't a decision I made lightly. It came with the weight of guilt and uncertainty, with the knowledge that there were no guarantees. But as we sat in therapy sessions, unraveling the knots we had tied ourselves in, I began to see a path forward. It wasn't easy and it wasn't perfect, but it was ours. I learned to listen to Mark in ways I hadn't before, not just to his words, but to the silences between them. I learned to speak my truth, even when it was uncomfortable, even when it meant admitting my own flaws. And slowly, he began to open up too, sharing parts of himself I hadn't seen in years. We were rediscovering each other not as the people we used to be, but as the people we were now, finding myself again. But perhaps the greatest lesson of all was the one I learned about myself. For so long I had defined myself by my roles: wife, homemaker, partner. I had poured so much of myself into those roles that I had forgotten who I was outside of them. James reminded me of that, and in doing so he gave me a gift I would carry long after he was gone. I started to take time for myself, to pursue the things that brought me joy. I went back to painting, something I hadn't done since college. I took long walks in the park, letting the rhythm of my footsteps calm my restless mind. I reached out to old friends, rebuilding connections I had let slip away. And as I did, I began to feel whole again, not because of Mark or James or anyone else, but because of me. I was learning to fill the void from within, to be my own source of strength and happiness. A farewell to the past. As I sat at the kitchen table that morning, I thought about James one last time. I didn't regret meeting him or the choices I had made. Regret felt too simple, too one-dimensional for something so complex. What I felt was gratitude for the lessons, for the growth, for the reminder that life is messy and beautiful and imperfect. I didn't know what the future held for me and Mark. I didn't know if we would make it or if the scars of the past would prove too deep to heal. But I did know this: I was no longer afraid to face it. I was no longer running from myself, from my truths, from the messy, complicated beauty of being human. So, as I finished my tea and watched the sunlight spill across the kitchen floor, I whispered a silent goodbye, not just to James, but to the woman I used to be. She had served her purpose, but it was time to let her go. It was time to step into the woman I was becoming, one step at a time. And for the first time in a long time, I felt free.